Oh, give thanks to the Lord. Call on his name. Make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him. Sing praises to him. Tell of all his wonderful works. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works he has done, his miracles and the judgments he uttered. O offspring of his servant Abraham, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. When he summoned famine against the land and broke every staff of bread, he had sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron until what he had said came to pass. The word of the Lord kept testing him. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions, to instruct his officials at his pleasure and to teach his elders wisdom. Praise the Lord. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. I was thrilled when I looked at the lectionary for this week and saw that the Old Testament passage was that of Joseph, and the psalm is the accompanying psalm with that story that we find beginning in Genesis 37. And I was so excited because it's one of the earliest Bible stories I remember just devouring as a kid. And I wish that I could tell you that's because, I just sat on a cloud with a halo around my head, and I just never, talked back to my parents, and I just sat in the Word of God all the days of my youth. But no. Really, it's because there is a musical that was very popular when I was a kid that kind of rocked my world, and it's called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Any fans? Yes. I loved that musical, and I memorized every single word. I even remember that all 7 siblings and I at some point made our parents endure like the whole 2-hour retelling of the musical in our living room, and we raided my grandma's closet and found like a coat of many colors to wear. And my one and only claim to fame in the musical theater world is that, in the 4th grade, I was the leading role of Joseph in like an elementary school production of it, which is hilarious and embarrassing, and thank God there's no proof. But as I said, I memorized every single word of this musical. And in case you were just curious of Andrew Lloyd Webber's take on the colors of Joseph's coat, it was red and yellow and green and brown and scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby and olive and violet and fawn and lilac and gold and chocolate and mauve and cream and crimson and silver and rose and azure and lemon and russet and gray and purple and white and pink and orange and blue. I'm sure my husband is sitting over there thinking, that's great that you can memorize all of that and still never manage to know where you put your keys or your phone. Sorry, babe, I love you. But even though that musical is so loosely based on the story that we find beginning in Genesis 37, what I love and what I was just kind of realizing this week is that even through this musical, it gave me the permission to realize that the text and the stories that we are a part of, that we find in the pages of our Bible, are not just black and white words on a page, right? They're full of color. They're full of people like you and I who mess up and get things wrong and try and find their way to walk in the ways of God. And so it's in that framework that I want to just dive right in to our narrative today, which is of Joseph. In Genesis 37, we are greeted with kind of the mess of humanity, I think. We see Joseph. He's this 17-year-old kind of spoiled brat. I mean, I'm just going to say it. He has this gifting and calling of leadership without any sort of grounding of wisdom and humility and maturity. He has these dreams that the Lord gives him, and instead of maybe waiting and asking counsel of when I should tell these dreams to others. We get this picture that he goes before his brothers. He's the 11th child of 12 children. And so he goes before his brothers and says, behold, I have this dream that behold, I was this tall sheaf of grain. And behold, you were these little sheaves of grain. And behold, you bowed down before me. Behold, I ruled you. I mean, like, not so much humility and grace in there. So we have Joseph. And then we have his father, Jacob, who kind of shamelessly shows favoritism to Joseph. And this always frustrated me to no end. Maybe because I'm in a family of 8 kids and can see that those dynamics get real tricky right there. But Jacob is just showing favoritism and giving him this coat of many colors. And as I was reading through the text and trying to live with this narrative, I did get some compassion for Jacob. I wonder, he had been told that the God of his fathers, of Abraham and Isaac and him, had told him that he would bless their line. He would make them as plentiful as the sand of the sea. Without measure would be his descendants. So his family line's pretty important, yeah? The thing is, his oldest sons have just failed him time and time again. Reuben is the oldest. He's the one who should be stepping into this calling as the eldest child. But we find out that he actually sleeps with his father's concubine. So there's that. Then Simeon and Levi, the next in line, they actually destroy an entire nation at Shechem because somebody from that nation defiled their sister, which was horrible. But the retaliation that they exacted did not show any sort of wisdom, and it could have made their entire line wiped out on the spot. And then next, we have Judah, and we find out later that he dishonors his daughter-in-law, and he has a winding way to kind of finding where he is supposed to live in the call of God on his life. And so maybe there's a part of Jacob that sees this gifting and this calling of Joseph, even though clearly he doesn't have the grounding yet, which I wish Jacob would come alongside of him. And also Joseph is this miracle baby. Rachel has been barren for years. When all of these 10 other children were born, Rachel was barren. And suddenly the Lord opens her womb and she has Joseph. And so maybe it makes sense to put stock in him. Well, then next we meet the brothers. We've already talked about a few of them, but they are filled with this jealousy and revenge, and in some ways, rightly so, maybe. Some scholars think that coat of many colors, I won't tell you the colors again, don't worry, was actually almost a garb of rule that Jacob gave to Joseph to kind of indicate, this is where I'm putting my money. This is who I am going to put to, rule everybody else. And it was a symbol that was very strong. And so we see that Joseph one day, on his father's request, is going out to kind of check in on his brothers, which, older siblings, I'm sure they loved that. No. And so he goes to check on them, and they see behold, Joseph coming with his coat of many colors. And they're like, we've got to get rid of this kid. I'm sick of this. And so they come up with a plot. Let's just kill him and be done with it. Let's just get it over with. And Reuben, we see this inkling of him trying to step into the calling of being the leader. And he says, no, let's not kill him. Let's just, not have his blood on our hands. Let's throw him in a pit. So they throw him in this pit. We know Reuben was gonna go get him, but he wasn't quite brave enough yet to tell his brothers that. But then all of a sudden these Ishmaelites come through, and Judah now is like, oh, this is perfect. Let's get rid of this kid who's making our lives miserable. His blood won't be on our hands, and we'll make a buck. Perfect, goodbye. And sells him to the Ishmaelites. And then they take that coat of many colors and smear it with the blood of a goat and bring it to Jacob and just, I'm so sorry, clearly Joseph is gone. And there's a lot of layers in that. And next we hear about Joseph. He is all the way in Egypt, and he's sold to the captain of the guard in Egypt, Potiphar. And it says that the Lord was with him and blessed everything he touched. And suddenly Joseph is rising to power within Potiphar's house. He's proving to be a man of integrity and honor, and Potiphar puts everything in his care. He has no worry in the world. Well, then Potiphar's wife sees that this guy is interesting. He's a good catch right here. I kind of like this Joseph guy. And so she tries to lure him and get him to have an affair with her. And she tries, it says day after day after day. And finally they're caught alone. And she's like, this is the moment. And she tries to kind of entangle him and get him to lie with her. And he runs away, but he accidentally leaves his outer garment because his clothes are just always getting him in trouble. He leaves his outer garment. She has it, and she creates this big scheme again. And she tells the guards, he tried to rape me. me. And she tells her husband, and her husband is obviously frustrated and angry, and he throws him in a pit. Well, here's what's interesting. He throws him in prison, but we know that most likely that was actually in the basement of Potiphar's house, okay? He was the captain of the guard. And so Potiphar he had the power to execute people. So there must have been something that he saw. Maybe this isn't fully true. He's shown to be honorable and full of integrity, and he spares his life in an act of mercy and puts him in the bottom of the prison. And then his very prison, he allows Joseph then again to rise in power. And suddenly in the prison, the second time that he is schemed against and thrown in a pit, he clearly does not give up, because slowly but surely the prison ward begins putting everything in his power again. So we know that then 11 years pass. We're not sure how long he was in the care of Potiphar, how long he was in the prison, but 11 years pass. And then these two guys are thrown in the pit with him in the prison. And there's a cupbearer and a baker for Pharaoh, the king of the land, the most powerful man in the world. And they're thrown with him, and because Joseph's in charge, he kind of, they're under his care, and he's talking to them, and they both have these dreams. And he says, well, tell me your dreams. And, he says, behold, behold, I can interpret things. No, he doesn't this time. Instead, he says, do not all interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dream. He interprets the dream. Unfortunately for the baker, in 3 days, he's going to be executed. But the cupbearer is going to be restored to power back at the right hand of Pharaoh. And he says, when you get up there, please remember me. And then it says, and he was forgotten. And then the scripture says 2 whole years pass. And one translation says 2 years of days pass. Because sometimes 2 years just doesn't feel like it does justice to what that means. But 2 years of days. And at this point, it had been 13 years of days of wondering, hey, God, have you forgotten me? What's going on? I have all of these questions that don't have answers. I've had these dreams that I'm still remembering, but you're not showing me anything. I'm forgotten by everybody. I'm here. I was in a pit, and then I rose up, and then now I'm in this prison. Where are you? 13 years of days. And then Pharaoh has a dream. He has a dream, he has 2 dreams, and nobody can interpret it for him. He sends in the magicians, he sends in everybody, and nobody can explain what this dream means. And the cupbearer's like, oh my goodness, you know what? Hey, Pharaoh, you remember that time when you threw me in prison? Yeah, we'll not talk about that. But there was a guy down there who can interpret dreams. He actually revealed to me that I'd be back here. So let's go get him. And so it says, quickly they summoned for Joseph. And he was shaven and brought before Pharaoh. Well, what a difference that 13 years of days are compared to that quickly. And Joseph better have been ready and mined the riches of those 13 years of days of waiting, those 13 years of trying to be fruitful, those 13 years of allowing honor and integrity to fill his life, allow groundedness of wisdom and humility to be a part of his story in those 13 years of days to be ready for his quickly. And we know that he was. He is summoned before Pharaoh quickly. And he stands before him, and Pharaoh tells him his dream. And Joseph, before he interprets, he stops. And he says, God will show you what is to be. The God, Ha Elohim, the God. Pharaoh is a god at the time. Everybody considers that, but he says to the God, or to a God, he says, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, my fathers, the God, he must be experiencing this. The God will show you what you are to do. The God that I thought might have just left me to die in these prisons, the God will show you what you are to do. He says there's going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine, and you better mine the riches of those abundant years. You better store up in storehouses the fruit of those years of abundance to get you through the famine. And Pharaoh says, you're hired. And this is such an interesting shift between behold, behold, Joseph, Joseph, who's learning integrity and honor, even in the unseen places with Potiphar's wife. Joseph, who is not giving up in the bottom of his second pit of his life in prison. He's continually pressing in. He's telling the cupbearer and the baker, no, don't all interpretations belong to God anyways. And then standing before the king of the world at the time and saying, the God will give you an answer. Here's what I think. I think there is not a chance in the world that behold, Joseph could have been ready for that quickly without those 13 years of days of waiting. Those 13 years of days of being able to be grounded in the gifting that God had already placed in him. Those 13 years of days of finding out who he is and who the Lord is when no one else is looking. And it was because of those 13 years of days of waiting that he was able to endure and steward the 7 years of abundance and the 7 years of famine. Because there's a lot of waiting in those 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. A lot of people are probably saying, this is in the abundance, this is never gonna end. Don't worry about it, this is great, let's just party. And he's being faithful because he's learned the muscles way before now. He is ready to step in. When that quickly came, he was ready, he was able to step in that. And we know that those years were very abundant for Joseph. He has 2 children during this time. He gets married, has 2 children. The first child is named Manasseh. And that name means God has made me forget my hardships and my father's house. But then a couple years later, he has another kid and he names him Ephraim because God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. And we find out later that Ephraim is actually exalted above Manasseh. And how often do we believe in the lie that to move on, we got to forget what happened? Forget all those people who wronged us. Forget all those people who made our lives a living hell. But instead, God is reminding us that we must be fruitful in the land of our affliction. Fruitful in our 13 years of days of waiting. Fruitful to build up the abundance, in the season of abundance, build up our storehouses with grain so that we can survive the famine. Well, then the famine comes and it strikes all the land. And they're prepared because Joseph has prepared for all of that time. But the famine strikes and it is so difficult, it says, that it made people forget the years of abundance because we're all so quick to do that, aren't we? Forget that God has been a God of provision throughout that time until we get to that place where the road seems hard and we forget that actually he's gonna feed us with the lessons and the fruit that he allowed to grow in us and in others in the years of days of waiting and the years of days of abundance so we can get through the years of days of famine. And so the famine comes and all of a sudden Jacob and his sons are back in the picture. It's so severe there, and so they hear, that somebody in Egypt is like prepared for this, and that they've got grain, and so to the 10 oldest brothers, again, Jacob's still kind of showing favoritism, keeping the youngest home. They go all the way to Egypt to buy grain. They go to Egypt, they stand before this crazy guy who they have no clue it's Joseph. Joseph knows that it's his brothers all of a sudden, and he's like, what in the world do I do? I tried to forget them, right? I named my first child, forget my father's house, but now they're here, and what do I do? It's been 20 years at least up to this point. And so I think we can give a little space for Joseph to kind of wig out. And we see him just grasping for straws here. And so he's calling them spies and asking about their family. And he ends up throwing all of them in prison. And then 3 days later, he keeps one in prison and lets the rest go back to retrieve their youngest son, their youngest brother, Benjamin, and come back. And so the brothers have no clue what in the world is happening. And they keep Simeon in prison, probably the exact same prison that Joseph was in. And they go back to Egypt. And when they get back to Egypt, they open their sacks and they see, oh my goodness, the money that we had to buy the grain is back in our sacks. Well, this guy was crazy and he thought we were spies already. Now we can't ever go. They imprisoned our brother. What are they gonna do with the rest of us? But then the years get harder of famine. And finally, Jacob will not let Benjamin go, but that's the only term that Joseph gave them. He will not give them any more unless they bring Benjamin. And so we see Reuben stepping up. And Reuben steps up, and clearly these 22 years of days of waiting for him are allowing him to step up into the man he's supposed to be. And he falls before Jacob, his father, and says, you must send Benjamin. If anything happens to him, you will have my life and the life of my 2 sons. Please let him go. Quite different than 22 years ago. He said, just throw him in a pit. That's mercy. And so they go back to Egypt. They see Joseph, and he is just undone, but still doesn't really trust these guys. 22 years ago, they sold him for nothing. They were going to kill him. They didn't show any sort of ability in them that he should honor at this time. They've ruined his life. So he sets up Benjamin and puts something in his sack and makes it look that he stole. And suddenly it's discovered. And instead of all the brothers just so easily saying, yep, take him, see you later, they fall before him and say, no, take us instead. Take us instead. Take us instead. We've been through this road before. It doesn't end out well. We've had 22 years of guilt that we can't get over. Take us instead. And Joseph is undone. And he sees this change in them. And he sends everybody else out of the room. And he stands before them and reveals who he is. And it's just like breathless in that space. Can't you imagine? And he says, 22 years later, and now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life, to preserve for you a remnant of the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me, it was God who sent me here. God has sent me here to preserve life of the ones who didn't care for my life, who threw me in a pit, who didn't care that they'd ever see me again or that I would prosper or anything. God has sent me to preserve life for you and your descendants, which means it's also for me and my descendants, maybe even more importantly than all the people that were saved in the midst of preparing for that famine. Exactly what our psalm says. That God had sent Joseph ahead to prepare the way. And I wonder if in that moment it just came full circle for Joseph. The dreams of the sheaves of grain and his brothers bowing before him, but now it's not behold Joseph anymore, huh? It is God sent me here, not you or me. I did nothing. God sent me here. I wonder if he pictured in those years of abundance when he filled the storehouses of grain where they were so much as immeasurable as the sand of the sea, it says. And let's pause there on that language. What is the promise that God, his father, of the father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had promised each of them separately that I would make your descendants immeasurable, as many as the sand of the sea. And now maybe Joseph is realizing he must have heard that promise to his family the 17 years that he was home. That his line was important, their line was important. And it's just full circle in that moment, and yet with such humility. So Joseph sends his brothers back home to retrieve their father and come back. And his father comes with all that is his, 70 people, not quite yet the sand of the sea. But he comes and he actually has 17 years with Joseph. The same number of years that he had at the beginning of Joseph's life. Jacob and Joseph had together. They have at the end of Jacob's life as God restores those lost years. And yet Jacob, his time on this earth is done and he passes away, and it's been 39 years since the brothers sold Joseph, and they still are riddled with that guilt. And we see them scheming yet again. And they come to Joseph and say, hey, didn't our father tell you that you're supposed to, be kind to us and forgive us, and we'll work for you and we'll do anything you ask, but he just wanted to remind us after he was gone that, you're supposed to be kind to us. And Joseph stops and weeps. And he says, do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them, because Joseph had allowed himself to be present in the seasons that he was called to be present in his 13 years of days of waiting, and the 7 years of days of abundance where people probably thought he was crazy, that he was filling the storehouses to their capacity. And he allowed himself to be present to steward those 7 years of days of famine that actually probably weren't too hard for Joseph. He was the second most powerful man in the world, but he knew that others needed to be fed by what he allowed to happen in his life, the fruit that he allowed to grow in his land of affliction in those 13 years of waiting and the 7 years of abundance, so others could be fed in their famine. And we also see by this picture at the end of Jacob's life that Joseph also allowed himself to be present in the unrecognized years that we have no idea what happened. Because sometimes it's really easy to trust that God is who he says he is in those seasons that are worthy of being recorded, but those unrecognized years, he still allowed that fruit to grow and to feed an entire nation, all the surrounding nations, and his people who would come after him. Joseph got to see a little bit of the fruit from his land of affliction. He got to see the promises of God fulfilled in his life. But Jacob didn't necessarily get to see it. The promise that God gave Jacob was that he would go to Egypt, but God would bring him back home. But guess what? It was 400 years until the Israelites came back home. 400 years of days of waiting. And so Jacob was present at the end of his life on his deathbed. He says, remember, this isn't home. This is great. This isn't home. Stay faithful, stay firm. Remember the promises of God. Be fed in your famine by what you've received in the years of abundance. Stay faithful in whatever season that you're in, and trust that the promises of God will come to pass. Even if you don't see it in your lifetime, delight in it. In the last few moments, I've asked my twin brother, Jonathan, to sing a song from the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, but the song is called Close Every Door to Me. And I just want to circle back to those years of days of waiting for Joseph. You know, it's really easy for us to see when we look on this story, well, yeah, but God had it all together, right? Like we see this, he had it all together. Even in the Israelites who wandered around for generations of 400 years, well, you know, it worked out great. But when you are in the middle of the pit, it's really hard for you to see the words that we see when we read the story of Joseph in the prison. You know what's written over in the introduction of that section of his narrative? It says, but the Lord was with him and his steadfast love covered him. But when you're in the pit, it's really hard to believe that the words over your life is that the Lord is with you and his steadfast love covers you. And so for those of you who feel like you are in the years of days of waiting, and you're trying to allow fruit to grow in the land of your affliction, but you don't see why yet, may you cling to the faithfulness of God, whose words are written over your life, just like in Joseph, that the Lord is with you and his steadfast love covers you. And even if you don't see some of the promises and dreams of God that he's placed in you, if you don't see them fulfilled in your lifetime, God is still the same God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the 400 years of Israelites. Every story that is in those pages, the same God there is the same God over your life. But I think he's more concerned with the fruit that we allow to grow in those seasons when we are present. Before we know it quickly will come, before we know abundance will come, before we know we have to prepare for the famine, when we allow that fruit to grow, I think that matters more than the destination. So as Jonathan sings the song, I pray that you know that you are seen and loved and that the steadfast love of the Lord covers you the same way it did for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.